My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because this is a fictional story about fear, misunderstanding, courage, and the surprising truth that can hide behind appearances. Sometimes the greatest danger is not what we think it is, but the assumptions we make before we know the whole story. This story begins on an ordinary evening in a quiet neighborhood where nothing seemed unusual, until one unexpected event changed everything. The rain had just stopped, leaving the streets glistening beneath the yellow glow of old streetlights. Most houses were dark except for one porch light that never seemed to turn off. You had noticed your neighbor many times before. They always appeared at unusual hours, quietly walking outside late at night, carrying small boxes into their garage, and disappearing again before sunrise. They rarely spoke to anyone, never attended neighborhood gatherings, and always seemed to avoid long conversations. The silence surrounding them slowly gave birth to countless rumors. Some believed they were simply private. Others imagined far more mysterious explanations. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. One evening, while taking out the trash, you noticed your neighbor quickly picking up an envelope that had accidentally fallen near your mailbox. They looked at it for several seconds before placing it carefully on your front step and quietly walking away without knocking. From inside your window, you watched the entire scene. 100 questions raced through your mind. Why were they standing near your house? Why didn't they ring the doorbell? Why did they leave so quickly? The mystery grew larger with every passing hour. Over the next several days, small events continued to fuel your curiosity. A strange noise came from the neighboring garage just after midnight. A delivery truck arrived early one morning carrying several sealed wooden crates. A security light repeatedly turned on in the middle of the night even though no one appeared outside. None of these events proved anything, yet together they created an unsettling feeling that something unusual was happening next door. The more you watched, the more your imagination filled the gaps that facts could not explain. Stay until the very end, because the biggest surprise had not yet arrived. One afternoon, while walking home from work, you noticed your neighbor speaking quietly with a police officer outside their home. The conversation looked serious. Papers were exchanged. The officer nodded before leaving. From across the street, it was impossible to hear what had been said. Yet seeing a police car parked outside was enough to make every rumor in the neighborhood grow even louder. By evening, neighbors had already begun inventing stories that spread faster than the truth ever could. Something huge was waiting in this story. That same night, just as a powerful storm rolled across the neighborhood, the electricity suddenly failed. The entire street disappeared into darkness. Rain pounded against windows while strong winds shook tree branches overhead. Looking outside, you noticed a flashlight moving through the darkness. At first your heart raced. The figure was walking directly toward your house. As they came closer, you realized it was your neighbor. For a brief moment, every frightening possibility crossed your mind. Then they called out through the storm, "Are you okay? A large tree branch has fallen near your back fence. I wanted to make sure everyone inside is safe." Their voice carried genuine concern rather than fear. Together, both of you walked carefully into the backyard, where the fallen branch had narrowly missed damaging part of your home. Working side by side in the rain, you cleared smaller branches until emergency workers could arrive. As dawn finally broke and the storm clouds drifted away, the mystery that had seemed so frightening began to dissolve. The late-night activity, the deliveries, the conversations with the police, none of them had been signs of danger. Your neighbor quietly explained that they volunteered with the local emergency response team and often stored disaster relief supplies in their garage. The police officer had been coordinating preparations for severe weather expected later that week. The late-night movements were simply part of helping others before emergencies occurred. Standing together beneath the first rays of morning sunlight, you realized how easily fear can grow when facts are missing. Rumors had created a story that reality never supported. The person everyone had quietly suspected had actually been spending countless hours preparing to help strangers during times of crisis. Looking across the now peaceful neighborhood, you smiled with quiet gratitude. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the person living next door. Sometimes it's allowing fear, assumptions, and unanswered questions to become louder than patience, conversation, and truth. And as the sun rose over the neighborhood, both of you realized that one honest conversation had accomplished what weeks of suspicion never could. It had transformed strangers into trusted neighbors, replacing fear with understanding and reminding everyone that the strongest communities are built not on rumors, but on kindness and communication. To be continued. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because although the storm had passed, another mystery was quietly beginning. The neighborhood looked peaceful once again. Fallen branches had been cleared away, children rode their bicycles through the streets, and neighbors stepped outside to inspect the small damage left behind by the heavy rain. Everything appeared normal. Yet as you stood on your porch enjoying the fresh morning air, you noticed your neighbor looking toward the edge of the street with an expression you had never seen before. It wasn't fear. It was concern, as though they had noticed something that everyone else had completely overlooked. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. Later that afternoon, while collecting your mail, you found a small envelope tucked inside the mailbox with no return address. Curious, you carefully opened it. Inside was only a single handwritten sentence. Be careful who you trust. Not every danger announces itself. There was no signature. No explanation. Just those 8 unsettling words. For a brief moment your heart began racing again. Was the note meant for you? Was it simply a prank? Or had someone accidentally delivered it to the wrong address? Questions filled your mind faster than answers could arrive. Instead of jumping to conclusions, you remembered everything the previous week had taught you about assumptions. Rather than hiding the note, you quietly showed it to your neighbor. They studied the handwriting for several moments before smiling gently. Let's not allow fear to write a story before we know the facts, they said. Their calm response immediately slowed your racing thoughts. Together you decided to ask a few nearby neighbors whether anyone else had received a similar letter. Something huge was waiting in this story. As the two of you walked from house to house, you quickly discovered that several families had received identical notes. Some had already become frightened. Others believed someone was playing an elaborate practical joke. One elderly couple admitted they had barely slept the previous night because the mysterious message had convinced them something terrible was about to happen. Rumors once again began spreading throughout the neighborhood, each version becoming more dramatic than the last. Stay until the very end, because the truth was closer than anyone realized. The following evening, the neighborhood association organized a small community meeting so everyone could share what they knew. Police officers attended as well, encouraging everyone not to panic and to report any suspicious activity instead of relying on rumors. During the meeting, one teenager quietly stood up with tears in their eyes and admitted responsibility. It turned out the anonymous notes had been part of an online mystery challenge that encouraged participants to leave cryptic messages around their neighborhoods without considering the fear they might cause. The room fell silent. The teenager apologized sincerely, explaining they had never intended to frighten anyone. They believed people would treat the notes like harmless puzzles. Instead, they had unintentionally reminded everyone how quickly uncertainty can become fear when communication disappears. Your neighbor looked around the room and quietly smiled. "Maybe we've all learned something important this week," they said. Real danger should always be taken seriously, but fear should never replace facts. The strongest protection any community has isn't suspicion. It's people who care enough to look out for one another and to speak openly before rumors grow. Those words remained in everyone's hearts long after the meeting ended. In the weeks that followed, neighbors who had barely known one another began talking more often. They exchanged phone numbers, organized evening walks, checked on elderly residents during storms, and created a small neighborhood watch focused not on fear, but on cooperation and kindness. The mysterious letters were eventually forgotten, but the friendships they inspired remained. As you stood outside one peaceful sunset watching children laugh and families gather together, you realized the greatest lesson had never been about mysterious notes or unusual neighbors. It was about choosing wisdom instead of panic, conversation instead of assumptions, and community instead of isolation. Sometimes the safest neighborhoods are not the ones without uncertainty. They are the ones where people face uncertainty together. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because just when everyone believed the neighborhood had finally returned to normal, a small discovery would raise a completely different kind of question. It wasn't the kind of mystery that inspired panic. It was the kind that invited patience, curiosity, and careful thinking. The peaceful street looked exactly as it always had. Children played basketball at the end of the block, birds rested on telephone wires, and neighbors watered their gardens beneath the warm afternoon sun. Yet sometimes the quietest days are the ones that quietly change everything. A few days after the community meeting, you decided to organize the garage that had become cluttered after the storm. Dust floated through the sunlight as you opened old boxes that had remained untouched for years. Behind a stack of forgotten shelves, you noticed a small metal container that wasn't yours. It was weathered with age and locked with a tiny brass latch. There was no name attached to it, only a faded sticker showing the outline of an old lighthouse. You couldn't remember ever seeing it before. For a moment your imagination started racing again, but this time you smiled and reminded yourself of the lesson you had recently learned. Not every mystery needs an immediate conclusion. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. Rather than forcing the container open, you carried it next door and asked your neighbor if they recognized it. The moment they saw the faded lighthouse sticker, their expression changed. They smiled with quiet surprise and said, "I haven't seen one of these in years." Curious, you asked what it meant. They explained that decades earlier, the neighborhood had organized an annual community time capsule project. Families placed letters, photographs, and personal memories inside sealed containers before hiding them in different locations around the neighborhood to be discovered years later. After many residents moved away, the tradition had gradually been forgotten. Excited by the possibility, both of you contacted the neighborhood association. Several longtime residents remembered the project and confirmed that many capsules had never been found. Together, neighbors gathered in the community hall to carefully open the forgotten container. Inside were handwritten letters, faded family photographs, newspaper clippings, children's drawings, and small keepsakes donated by families who had once lived on the same street. Every item told a simple story about hopes for the future, dreams for the neighborhood, and reminders to always care for one another no matter how much time passed. Something huge was waiting in this story. Not danger, but discovery. Among the papers was a letter written by one of the original neighborhood founders nearly 30 years earlier. It read, "If you're reading this, it means our neighborhood has survived many seasons. Some years will bring storms. Others will bring celebrations. New families will arrive, and old friends will move away. But remember this, the greatest strength of any community is not the buildings we construct. It is the trust we build between the people who live inside them. Look after one another. Speak kindly. Ask questions before believing rumors. Leave this place a little better than you found it." The room became wonderfully quiet as those words were read aloud. Several older residents wiped away tears while younger families smiled at the unexpected message left by people they had never met. Looking around the room, you realized something remarkable. The frightening rumors that had once divided everyone had unexpectedly brought the neighborhood closer together. People who had barely exchanged greetings were now sharing meals, organizing volunteer projects, and helping one another with everyday tasks. Stay until the very end, because one final surprise remained. Your neighbor quietly reached into the container and removed a small photograph. It showed dozens of smiling families gathered in front of the neighborhood entrance many years ago. Pointing toward one corner of the picture, they laughed softly. "That's me," they said, revealing a much younger version of themselves standing beside parents who had long since passed away. For the first time, you understood why they cared so deeply about the neighborhood. It wasn't simply the place where they lived. It was the place where generations of memories had been created. As everyone carefully returned the keepsakes to the container, the neighborhood association voted to begin the tradition again. New families wrote letters for future generations, children added colorful drawings, grandparents shared stories of resilience, and everyone contributed one small hope for the years ahead. Together, you buried a brand new time capsule beneath the same old oak tree where neighbors now gathered each spring. Walking home beneath the evening sky, you smiled at how differently the story had ended from where it began. What first appeared to be a tale of suspicion had become a reminder that understanding grows through conversation, trust, and shared experiences. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are not hidden inside mysterious boxes, they are found in the connections we build with the people living right beside us. And as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, the neighborhood felt less like a collection of houses and more like a place where everyone truly belonged. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because after the new time capsule was buried beneath the old oak tree, everyone believed the neighborhood's greatest mystery had finally been solved. The streets felt warmer somehow. Neighbors who had once hurried past one another now stopped to talk, children played until sunset, and every evening seemed quieter than the last. Yet sometimes life doesn't reveal its greatest lessons during moments of fear. Sometimes they arrive disguised as simple coincidences that slowly connect together like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. A few weeks later, while helping clean the community hall, you discovered a faded map folded inside an old filing cabinet. The paper was fragile with age, its edges worn from decades of careful handling. Across the top someone had written, "Neighborhood Heritage Project." Curious, you carefully spread the map across a large wooden table. Small handwritten notes marked places that no longer existed, an old bakery, a tiny library, a community garden, and a stone fountain that had disappeared many years before. In one corner, a short sentence caught your attention: "Every place has a story. Protect the story, and the community will never lose its heart." Listen carefully, because this changes everything. Rather than keeping the discovery to yourself, you invited your neighbor to take a look. The moment they saw the map, their face brightened with recognition. "My grandfather helped draw this," they said quietly. "He always believed every generation should leave something better for the next." Together you visited several of the marked locations. Most had changed completely over the years, yet each place still carried small reminders of the people who had lived there before. An old stone wall covered with ivy, a weathered bench beneath a giant tree, and a faded mural hidden behind newer buildings. As word spread about the map, more longtime residents began sharing stories they had never told before. One family brought photographs from the neighborhood's first summer festival. Another shared newspaper clippings describing how neighbors worked together after a flood many years earlier. An elderly woman opened a carefully preserved scrapbook filled with handwritten recipes, community celebrations, and letters exchanged between families who had long since moved away. Piece by piece, a forgotten history slowly returned to life, reminding everyone that communities become strong not because difficult times never happen, but because people face them together. Something huge was waiting in this story. Inspired by everything they had discovered, the neighborhood decided to organize its very first Heritage Day. Children interviewed grandparents about life decades ago. Artists restored the faded mural hidden behind the old buildings. Volunteers planted flowers where the original community garden had once stood. Musicians filled the park with songs while families shared homemade meals beneath strings of warm lights. The celebration wasn't about the past alone. It became a promise to protect the kindness, generosity, and unity that earlier generations had worked so hard to build. As evening arrived, everyone gathered beneath the same old oak tree where the new time capsule rested safely beneath the ground. The neighborhood leader smiled and asked each family to light a small lantern. One by one, soft golden lights illuminated the park until it seemed as though hundreds of tiny stars had settled among the branches. Looking around, you noticed something extraordinary. The people who had once viewed one another with suspicion were now laughing together, exchanging stories, and planning future projects side by side. Stay until the very end, because the most meaningful moment had not yet arrived. Your neighbor quietly stepped forward holding the faded map. They looked around at every familiar face before saying, "When this story began, many of us believed the greatest danger came from not knowing our neighbors. Now we've learned the opposite. The greatest danger is allowing fear, silence, and assumptions to keep good people apart. A neighborhood becomes safe not because everyone is the same, but because everyone chooses to care." The crowd responded with warm applause as children released dozens of paper lanterns into the evening sky. They drifted upward slowly, reflecting across the calm lake nearby like tiny stars carried by the